This is Harsh Rules, I'm Ben Harsh, and today we're going to learn to play Conflict of Heroes Storms of Steel, the 3rd edition. Conflict of Heroes Storms of Steel was released in 2019 by Academy Games and designed by Uwe Eickart and Gunther Eickart. This game supports up to 4 players and takes from 1 to 4 hours to play. Let's begin by learning about Storms of Steel's game pieces. Soviet and German forces are represented by double-sided cardboard counters called units that enable players to reenact historical World War II battles in Kursk. In this episode, we will learn about squad-level units to prepare you to play Storms of Steel's first training mission, the Courier's Satchel. The unit I'm displaying on the screen is a Soviet rifle squad. A squad represents a fighting force of 6 to 12 men. In some cases, a unit's name may be followed by a year designation. The year indicates the training and equipment loadout for that unit based on that time period. Therefore, while all missions take place in 1943 Kursk, some squads may still be operating with equipment and training from previous years in the war. The unit statistics represent these differences. Therefore, to ensure players are using the correct units, a scenario will call out the counter number shown just above the name. Each counter in the game has a unique number associated with it. This identification system helps players organize their game pieces for setup and storage. Looking at the counter, you'll see several numbers in distinct colors and positions. The meaning of all this may seem a bit overwhelming, so let's break it all down. So first, let's divide the counter in half. The top half of the counter is for the unit's action cost and navigation. A unit's action cost to attack is in the upper left-hand corner. The base cost to move a unit is in the upper right-hand corner. Most types of terrain hexes can be entered with the base movement cost. However, more rugged terrain may cost more. In the 3rd edition rules for Conflict of Heroes, whenever a unit conducts an action, there is a chance that it will become spent. The higher the action cost, the greater the chance that this will happen. To determine the outcome, the player will reference the bottom of their commander track and complete a spent check. As an example, let's say the Soviet rifle squad chooses to fire at the enemy for an attack cost of 4. Once the shot is resolved, the attack cost of 4 is mapped to the track. The Soviet rifle squad has a 60% chance of becoming spent. Next, the player will roll a custom 10-sided die. If the die result is greater than the action cost, the unit remains fresh and can be used again on the next turn. However, if the die result is equal to or less than the action cost, the unit becomes spent. When this happens, the counter is flipped over to its striped side. When units on both sides are all spent, or both sides choose to pass, then the game round ends. When a unit becomes spent, it can no longer complete actions on its own for the rest of the game round. However, a player may spend their own limited number of command action points, or caps, to spur the unit into action again. A player's caps are managed at the top of the commander track. For the first mission, the Courier's Satchel, both players begin with 6 command action points. Command action points represent the leadership and logistics support a fighting force depends on to remain effective. Caps are essentially the means a player uses to implement this leadership support, but this support is limited. Command action points can also be spent to modify a dice roll. For a D10 spent check, every cap will reduce the action cost by 1. This will increase the probability that a player's unit will pass their spent check and remain fresh. While we're on the topic, let's discuss one last factor regarding spent checks. Be aware that when a unit is used repeatedly, it becomes stressed. After a player takes an action with a unit, they place a stress marker on it as a reminder. On their next turn, if they decide to use that unit again, they must add a +1 to that unit's action cost. However, it's important to note that using the unit a third time does not increase the number of stress markers placed on it. One marker is the maximum regardless of how many times the unit is activated in a row. Also important to note, if on the next turn the player instead decides to use a different unit, they remove the stress marker from the last unit and place it on the unit they did use. Remember, the stress marker is merely used to keep track of the last unit activated. Now, let's talk about the last indicator, which is the green arc symbol at the top of the counter. This is the direction the unit is facing, and the angle of the green strip indicates the unit's firing arc. In the military, soldiers move in an organized formation that maximizes their offensive and defensive capabilities. A unit's facing indicates the direction of that squad's attention. As a result, the unit always moves in the direction of its facing and can only acquire targets within its firing arc. And when a unit acquires its target, it's time to talk about combat. With that in mind, let's turn our attention to the bottom half of the counter, which is all about combat abilities. A unit's combat abilities are color-coded based on target and defense type. Red numbers reference soft targets, such as soldiers. Blue numbers indicate armored targets, like tanks. To keep these number colors straight, I just remember red blood, blue steel. The lower left-hand corner of the counter displays the unit's firepower. The top number indicates the unit's firepower versus soft targets. The bottom number versus armored targets. Obviously, this Soviet rifle squad is less effective against armored targets like tanks than against soft flesh and blood opponents like other soldiers. The lower right-hand corner of the counter displays the unit's defense ratings. Since this is a rifle squad, the defense stats are in red. The top number is the unit's flank defense. The bottom number is the unit's front defense. The type of defense in play is based on the direction of an attack to the unit. Front defense is employed when an attack comes through the front 3 hexes of the unit. A flank defense is used when an attack comes from the rear 3 hexes behind a unit. Now that we've learned the statistics at the bottom of the counter, we can quickly put together the basic combat equation. A target's defense rating minus the attack rating equals the hit number. This is the number that the player must meet or beat by rolling 2 6-sided dice. By looking at the bottom of the counter, you merely toggle the appropriate stats. On the target's counter, the bottom right indicates which defense numbers to use. This is all based on the direction of the attack to the target. An attack through the flank hexes use the top defense number. An attack from the front hexes use the bottom defense number. The attacker references the bottom left of the counter and uses the red top number for soft targets and the blue bottom number for armored targets. In this example, the target is another squad, so the attacker would use the red soft target attack rating. Printed on the lower edge of the counter center on top of the unit's nationality emblem is its range. Range is the distance in hexes that the rifle squad can attempt to hit a target. For example, this Soviet rifle squad has a range of 6 hex spaces. This is considered the unit's normal range. Target proximity is important when considering range. An attacking unit receives a +3 to their attack rating when the target is adjacent to them, which is considered to be short range, and they receive a +4 to their attack rating if the target is in the same hex or close range. A unit can also take long-range shots up to double their hex range. However, shots beyond normal range are penalized by a -2 to the unit's attack rating. Now that we understand the mechanics for the game's main game pieces, let's learn about the various actions a unit can take while playing the game. For the remainder of this episode and the subsequent episode in this series, we will focus on basic actions the players can conduct with their units. Once you learn these basic actions, you'll be ready to play Scenario 1, the Courier's Satchel, and Scenario 2, Twilight's Last Gleam. In these two scenarios, players can conduct 5 basic actions. Movement can cost a unit from 1 to 5 action points. This depends on the unit's base movement cost, plus the difficulty of the terrain the unit is attempting to enter. An attack action can cost from 2 to 6 points. Attacks are multi-step processes requiring the player's unit to be within range of a target, establish line of sight, and then fire. If the player scores a hit marker is drawn and applied to the target. We will cover the attack action in the next episode. Logically, following an attack is the rally action, which costs 5 action points. When a player rallies with their unit, they're attempting to remove a hit marker before their unit is hit again and eliminated. Conducting a stall action with a unit only costs 1 action point. A unit takes a stalling action to give the player an opportunity to wait and assess the battlefield situation. Stalling is a much different tactic than passing. If the player passes, they risk the opportunity that their opponent will pass as well and end the game round. Finally, a player may need to spend action or command action points to play a card. Cards provide varied game effects and may or may not cost points to use. We'll look at cards in greater detail in a subsequent episode. And now that we know our plan, let's walk through each of these actions in greater detail, starting with movement. Let's pause for a brief moment and cover off on counter position basics. A unit's direction on the game board is called its facing and is indicated by a green arc at the top of the counter. The edge of the counter must always be aligned with the hex edge for the direction it's facing. A counter can never face a corner of a hex. The unit's facing also orientates its front and flank. The 3 adjacent hexes above the facing are called the front hexes, and the 3 adjacent hexes behind the unit's facing are called the flank hexes. When the counter changes direction, the orientation of its front and flank also follow. While Conflict of Heroes Storms of Steel has hex rules similar to other wargames, there are some common rules that are distinct, such as unit stacking. In this game, units may occupy the same hex as friendly or enemy units. Units occupying the same hex are said to be stacked. There is no limit to the number of units that can occupy a single hex, and those units may face different directions. While we're discussing hex rules, let's also discuss control markers. Mission 1, the Courier's Satchel, uses a control marker to represent the satchel. Control markers are double-sided counters that show Soviet control on one side and German control on the other. The game begins with the satchel under the control of Soviet forces. For the control marker to change sides, both of the following must occur. The controlling side has no units in the objective hex, and the opposing side has a unit with positive firepower, either red or blue, in the objective hex, even if just moving through. These rules apply not only for the control marker representing the satchel, but for control markers that represent other objectives throughout the scenarios. Let's discuss unit movement and terrain. A unit conducts movement in one of 3 ways. When a unit based around soldiers moves, it's considered foot movement. This is indicated by the movement cost being colored red on the counter. Wheeled vehicles movement stat is colored in green, and tracked vehicles movement stat is colored blue. Each of these units' movement types handle terrain in different ways. The first 2 scenarios do not use vehicles of any kind. This gives players an opportunity to focus their attention on learning the fundamentals with foot movement. Therefore, I will cover wheeled and tracked vehicle movement later in their own episode. A movement action is based on a calculation, beginning with the unit's base movement cost And if the player took an action with that unit in the previous turn, they will need to add 1 additional point for stress. Next, the player references the terrain type they wish to move the unit into and checks to see if there's any additional cost. This sum is the total action cost, which is then referenced for a spent check. The good news is that most terrain on the maps do not cost any additional points to enter. Indigenous terrain to the region include open grasslands, corn and wheat fields, roads, and balka, which are all free. And if you're like me and you didn't know, balka are drainage gullies that crisscross the Russian steppes. Some can be quite abrupt, which is why there is a small balka type as well that costs 2 points to enter. Also note that when a squad follows a road from hex to hex, this allows them to ignore the surrounding terrain type. For example, a road running through a forest. Other terrain is not so easy. The general rule is, the more rugged the terrain, the more cost and movement points. Rivers being the extreme example, costing a foot unit 5 additional points to enter. Wheeled and tracked vehicles will handle this terrain differently. Some terrain may even prohibit a vehicle from entering. We'll look at those cost charts in a subsequent episode in this series. Now, let's look at some other foot unit maneuvers that a player may implement to position their units. As I mentioned earlier, soldiers move in organized formations that maximize their offensive and defensive capabilities. In these formations, soldiers have specific roles, such as those bearing heavy weapons. As a result, repositioning the whole squad and maintaining battle effectiveness is no easy task. A unit's facing in a hex is critical as it determines the direction of its focus and firing arc. Often, a player will need to reposition their unit to engage an enemy target. There are 3 ways to change a unit's facing. First, the player may take a movement action and pivot their unit in place. This costs 1 action point and allows the unit to reset their facing to any direction within the hex. Next, a player may conduct a moving pivot. A moving pivot is included with a standard movement action for free. Once a player moves into a hex, they can pivot their unit to face any direction. Now this may seem strange since it costs 1 point to move a unit within the hex. Actually, it's easier to angle a formation on the move. Once a unit is in place and each man has established positions, they need to then get up and move around again to find their new place. Therefore, the need to pay 1 action point to move around in the hex. Next, a player may need to back up without turning their flanks to the enemy. When a unit moves into one of its 3 flank hexes, it is considered to be moving backwards. Moving backwards adds a +1 action point move penalty to a unit's move cost. This penalty is also added to any other move cost penalties such as difficult terrain. However, when a unit moves backwards, they may also still freely pivot in any direction. Now that we've completed our look at foot unit movement, in the next episode of this series, we will continue learning the basic actions and delve into combat by studying the attack and rally actions. If you found this video helpful, please give me a like and share with your friends. To be the first notified when the next episode of Harsh Rules becomes available, please hit the bell icon for notifications. And as always, this has been Harsh for Harsh Rules. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.